Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Food System Horizons webinar on a Friday lunchtime. I hope you have lunch sitting with you, or like me, you already scoffed it earlier on, so you can focus on the webinar. Today is a really special session, and before I introduce our presenters, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land by which we host this webinar here in Meanjin in Brisbane, the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and would like to pay respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. This topic that we have is a little bit of a different one for CSIRO, and that's why we're really excited about it, because we don't actually work in the school food space, but we do know that looking into the feasibility of a universal school food program was one of the recommendations of the Feeding Australia report. And so this is a really good opportunity to actually check in to see where are we at now, what can we learn from the work that's been done by Liesel, Miriam, and Katherine in this space, and what might that mean for our new food security strategy moving forward. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. And first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Miriam Williams. So they'll be speaking one after the other. Miriam is a senior lecturer in geography and planning at Macquarie University and deputy director of the Macquarie University Housing and Urban Research Centre. Her research explores how urban environments can be made more just and caring, and with a focus on food provisioning, public space planning, and infrastructures of care. Next, we have, I think the order is it Liesel? Next, yes, Liesel. Associate Professor Liesel Spencer, School of Law at Western Sydney University. Liesel's research interests are in public health law and food systems governance, which is something we're very interested in, focusing on regulation of food security. Liesel's research in this area spans school food programs, social security law, both in Australia and overseas, the impact of the cost of living crisis on food security and urban agriculture. And as you can probably see from that description, she is a lawyer who is interested in very diverse sort of domains, but also diverse methodologies, including empirical methods, comparative law, and legal geography. And last but not the least, we've got Dr. Katherine Kent from the University of Wollongong. Katherine is a public health nutritionist and senior lecturer at the University of Wollongong, where she teaches and leads research on food insecurity, food systems governance, and public health nutrition. Her work focuses on improving food access and equity through evidence-informed policy and community-based initiatives. Katherine has led large-scale studies and advocacy projects, including the Let's Talk About Food survey in the Illawarra Shoalhaven, which we heard about earlier, actually, and research into student food insecurity. She contributes nationally through Nutrition Society of Australia, the Australian Academy of Sciences National Committee for Nutrition, and the Household Food Security Data Coalition. And I'm going to pass on to the team now. Miriam, you will need to unmute yourself because I muted everyone when we had background noise, but I will pass on to Miriam to start this talk.
Thank you so much, Lily, and thank you to everyone for coming today. It's great to be able to talk about this topic, which we are very passionate about and we feel is a really important thing to be talking about in the current landscape of what's happening in Australia in relation to food. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we are located. We have speakers from the Wadi Wadi saltwater peoples, Dharawal Nation land, from Dharawal country, and from the lands of the Darug and Gundungurra people. So we'd like to pay respects to elders past and present, to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are on the call, and to acknowledge that this land has been cared for millennium. And so today we're going to be talking through a range of different topics, beginning with discussion of setting the scene, which is providing some background context on the current school food landscape before introducing some international perspectives on what's happening elsewhere in terms of how school food provisioning is being done. We're then going to be talking about why we might need to think differently about school food, why we might consider doing school meals differently? What are the opportunities that can be addressed by doing it differently? We're then going to be talking about what we're doing as a team, our progress to date, where to from here. And then we really want to hear from you around what you might see or perceive to be any particular barriers or opportunities to universal school meals, and what you think are some of the next steps to overcome these. So to begin, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context around the current school food landscape in Australia, which again is quite context specific. It's different to what's happening in other parts of the world. And Liesel will be taking us through some examples of other ways that meals happen at school. But just to provide some background of why we might be thinking through the possibilities and the problems of school food in the Australian context, is to understand that 1/3 of meals, 1/3 of the daily intake of food is consumed by children at school. So it's quite a significant proportion of the food that they actually eat. Which makes it important to both their health and well-being. In terms of what's currently happening, I'm sure there's many people who have packed school lunches this morning for their children, but the majority of students at schools will go to school with food that has been packed by a parent or guardian, and they eat what's in that lunchbox during the school day. Most meals, from research that has been done, we know that many and most of those meals that people consume at school don't meet nutritional guidelines, and are stored in school bags most often that pose food safety risks that we don't always sort of consider and think about. There are also significant inequities in access to healthy food. And we can understand that at a population scale by sort of thinking about the ways that families have access to different types of food, maybe not eating enough fresh fruit and vegetable, as often studies show, and the balance of what is consumed at school is reflective of that. And there's a whole range of fabulous work that's been done on the composition of school lunchbox, etc. We also have a reliance on understanding how we have inequities in terms of the type of food that's available for people. Food matters for many different reasons, and I'm sure those who are working in this food space understand why it might be very important, but particularly including as a contribution to both physical and mental health and well-being, academic success, and also development for children at this really crucial time of development. We also have the significant presence of canteens and tuck shops, which have played a role in Australian schools for a very long period of time. And Liesel and I were part of a conversation, a national roundtable that was run by the Federation of Canteens in Schools earlier in the year, and in helping them author a consensus statement from that roundtable that sort of highlights some of the complex ways in which canteens are currently operating and some of the barriers and challenges that they're facing in terms of providing food in schools currently. We have seen over time that canteens were once a staple institution, which were open 1-2 days a week, maybe more in some contexts, very much reliant upon volunteers and parents and guardians in supporting the operation of canteens. Many canteens today are being outsourced. It's a different sector today than perhaps we experienced when we were at school. Some are closing, and there is also this privatisation occurring of the school canteen space, which impacts the access of students to these infrastructures at school as a way to supplement the food that is provided at home each week. There's also concerns around affordability as well. So the National Roundtable that was hosted early in the year identified that canteen food provisioning is currently at risk in Australia, from things like staffing and volunteer shortages. There's, issues around low wages, high burnout rates of canteen staff and volunteers. There were concerns raised about the financial instability of some of these canteens due to rising food costs and limited funding, and the difficulty that canteens have in providing food at affordable prices, most often because they're purchasing food from retailers just like other people rather than wholesalers, and so there are those issues there. There's also outdated infrastructure and inadequate equipment in some cases, and also these complex regulations and compliance requirements, each of which were raised as part of this national roundtable. So the current way that school food is provisioned in terms of canteens needs to be considered and addressed. And this consensus statement, which if people are interested, you can read this, sort of highlights the asks from the Federation of Canteens in Schools Australia. So also we see across the Australian school food provisioning landscape, it's a patchwork of a range of different programs that are doing fantastic things at the same time as meeting some of these really complex challenges around food insecurity, understood to be people's inability to access safe, affordable, nutritious and culturally appropriate food regularly. So we can see a range of different programs currently operating in schools, most often led by the not-for-profit sector, that are doing some innovative things such as the school meals projects, where we see pilots led by a range of different groups, including this Tasmania project that Liesel is going to talk about, School Food Matters and others. And these school meal projects are really important in showing that there are other ways to do food in schools. There's been a range of different pilots led by the Caring Futures team at Flinders University and being evaluated. These school meal projects also involve nutrition education and curriculum development, and just provide an insight into how things can be done in a different way. We also note there are a range of different food relief programs that are operating across Australia in Australian schools. We can see the school breakfast programs, which are run in partnership with food redistribution charities like Food Bank, which have either individual partnerships or generous donors that are providing food for students for breakfast, which are often foods such as cereals, toasts, spreads and fruit, and only certain schools in Australia have access to these because they meet particular criteria or have the resourcing and volunteers and support of the school to actually enable this to happen. We also have a range of different not-for-profit organisations who are running education initiatives involving food growing and cooking at schools. And these include both gardening and cooking programs and food literacy programs. These supplement meals that are provided at school. They provide vegetables and fruit for consumption at home. They're often grant and partnership dependent. And organisations like OzHarvest have got their food education programs. We also have organisations like Food Ladder, Stephanie Alexander Kitchen Garden Foundation, and Farm It Forward, which is a not-for-profit based in Katoomba in the Blue Mountains that is partnering with a local high school to grow food in greenhouses. And then we have the emergence of food relief lunches that are provided by a charity called Eat Up that provides free cheese sandwiches, fruits and snacks every 3 weeks to partner schools across Australia that are addressing this increased concern around food insecurity to support health and wellbeing of students. So as you can see, there's a range of different programs. There are a range of different NGOs. There are a range of different models of delivering these types of programs. And so what we're really interested in exploring is how can these different programs be enhanced? How might we do food differently in Australian schools? So one of the options for doing food differently is through what's called universal school meal programs. And they provide all children in schools access to nutritious meals every day, regardless of family income, regardless of their background and their ability to afford and pay for things. So there are particular principles of universal school meal programs that bring them together in terms of highlighting the idea of universal access to these school meals. And we can see examples of these globally and how they've run for many, many years. I was recently in Sweden and got to have a look at a school meals program that had been running in Sweden since the 1950s. And when I said Australia didn't have one, they were like, but what? How does this happen? But so the universal school meal program is very much based on the following different types of characteristics. So often every student is included. There are no free meals for some students and not others, but there's ways that their free meals are provisioned in a way that people don't realise that my food is different to someone else's food. There are different ways to do that. So equitable access is a very key theme of these different meals. We also have nutrition as being a key guide for universal school meal programs. So they're guided by dietary standards that are put in place to clearly support health and development of children across the life course. They're delivered at school, but they're not always delivered in things like cafeterias. They can also be provided by partners that are like in the Tasmania School Food Project, that are actually cooking off-site and then delivering. So there's a range of different ways they can be provided, but they are eaten at school. And this removes the burden from parents and carers of actually preparing school lunch boxes. There are a range of different funding options, but majority are government supported. Sometimes there can be a mix of means testing contributions in certain countries, funded by public investment as well. And there are also co-benefits. So there's potential, and different programs will have different emphasis on this particular area. There's potential for school meals program to be created and designed in a way that support local economic development by creating local partnerships with growers and suppliers in the local area of which the food is consumed. There's also food waste reduction programs. There are a whole range of different added benefits that can be part of our universal school meal program. And I'm going to hand over now to Liesel.
So Australia's biggest pilot to date is happening down in Tasmania, and the experience of Tasmania is documented in some evaluations from Menzies Centre down at the University of Tasmania, with some really promising results, including some perhaps unexpected things like improved social interactions around meals and children expanding their palates and their willingness to try new foods. This project was launched by the hard work and consistent advocacy over many years from Julie Dunbaben, and we'd just like to acknowledge Julie's been a really generous mentor to our team in advocating for expanding school meals to New South Wales. Slide, please. So we're one of the last countries not to provide universal school meals programs. Canada was one of the other last standouts not to have a school meals program, but they've committed $1 billion from 2024 to expanding pilots across Canada. Denmark started a pilot for 20,000 students in 2025 with plans to expand. Other than Australia, pretty much Norway and the Netherlands, amongst the high-income countries, notably don't have a school lunch program. So Australia's policy approach, it's looking increasingly out of step with that global trend to providing all children with a healthy daily meal at school. Slide, please. So why would we be looking to the rest of the world to instigate changes in the way Australia does domestic law and policy? It's a pretty time-honoured tradition to look over the neighbour's fence and see if there's a better solution there. We obviously can't just cut and paste or be utopian or uncritical about it. So we look for sort of the good, the bad and the ugly and see what's worth borrowing and what's worth adapting to our social and environmental context here. So with that in mind, the first example of another country that we could learn useful things from and also some traps to watch out for would be the United States National School Lunch Program. Definitely a mixed bag in terms of what we can learn in that comparative study of law and policy on school meals. It's had some notable success in reducing childhood food insecurity, some success in improving childhood nutrition and academic outcomes. There's a lot to unpack in the evidence base and it's not clear cut. Notably, the US program has a sliding fee scale, so it's means tested from free to subsidised all the way up to full fee. But changes to the eligibility criteria under the current US administration, it's reducing how many children are going to receive school meals, which could really be devastating in terms of supporting vulnerable kids. There's long-standing issues with meal quality, the influence of the industrial food sector on procurement and menus, erosion of nutrition guidelines. Pizza is not a vegetable. So there's some other important takeaways also from the US experience about provision of meals during school holidays being critically important to support kids who otherwise wouldn't be receiving food in those school holidays, so the most vulnerable populations. And also a really important takeaway that meal delivery should be designed so all kids are treated equally and we have no visibility on who's receiving free or subsidised meals, and we avoid stigmatising groups of children. Slide, please. So Finland's program's been running the longest of any in the world, over 75 years, and that provision of healthy school lunches to every kid, every school, every day from preschool through to the end of high school, that's an entrenched cultural norm. So there are people who, senior citizens who don't remember it ever being any different. And because of that, there's strong public support for the significant commitment of government funds. Introducing a universal program in Australia will have to overcome the hurdle of doing things in quite a radically different way to what we're used to, and a sort of significant culture and mindset shift. Some of the most useful lessons Australia can learn from the Finnish program are the integration of food education into the curriculum and the legislative guarantees of an inclusive approach to children who have special dietary needs. So that includes allergies, but also things like ethics or religious beliefs. Slide, please. Brazil's a world leader in government intervention in healthy diets and food security, and the school lunch program is really a key part of their regulatory approach. So despite what are significant differences in context between our two countries, there are, I think, two key lessons that Australia can take from the Brazilian example. Firstly, that strict, not negotiable nutrition guidelines are really key for fencing out the influence of industrial food and undermining the healthiness of the program and therefore its benefits. And secondly, and I think this is really interesting, using procurement policy for the school meals program with a legislative requirement that 30% of the ingredients be sourced from local small-scale food producers like family farms. It's also had the effect of supporting some of the minority Indigenous food-producing families in Brazil. So it's had a real social and racial equity benefit that's perhaps an unexpected co-benefit or second-tier benefit from universal school meals. Slide, please. So Japan's National School Lunch Program is entrenched in legislation, and that contains really clear legislative purposes or goals for the program, very diverse and very all-encompassing, really. So including, a breadth of purposes from healthy child development for children to develop, and this is not a great translation, sorry, but good judgment of food choices or understanding healthy diets, social cooperation, cultural awareness, and environmental awareness. Now, famously, Japanese school children are taught the nutritional value and provenance of the food served in schools with that strong integration into curriculum and support from in-school nutritionists who are 6-year degree trained, so they take it very seriously. Japan, unsurprisingly, has the lowest rates of childhood overweight and obesity in the world, something that concerns policymakers in Australia. There's a really strong social norm that kids will try all foods put in front of them. So they develop sophisticated palates pretty early on from kindy compared to most Western kids. And certainly, I guess it's hard to imagine a Japanese child refusing to eat anything but chicken nuggets, for example. However, without wanting to over-valorize that or oversimplify it, the expectation that everyone will eat the same meal without fuss, that has a downside. The Japanese program, whilst it's achieved amazing things, it's not truly universal or inclusive because children with allergies, food intolerances, and preferences such as being vegan or vegetarian, they're not catered for, and they're expected to bring a packed bento box lunch from home. Next slide, please. So whilst there's a lot of evidence-based reasons, including evaluations of the Tasmanian pilot, existing patchwork of initiatives in Australia, and all of that overseas evidence base, which is huge, all of that evidence is sitting there as what seems like sound, research-informed reasons that Australia should introduce a universal access school meals program. But we can't ignore the elephant in the room of radical law and policy change, which is political feasibility. Is the policy window open to this change? And if not, how do we wedge it open? How do we get from here to there? So we can learn from the experience of other countries who've more recently succeeded in introducing or universalising school meals programs. And key factors that are sort of being critically important across jurisdictions seem to be cultivating bipartisan political support, and raising awareness of international norms so that people in government are aware of the extent to which Australia is really lagging behind the rest of the world on school meals. Changing public discourse and building public support for doing things differently. And we saw this in, for example, social media reactions to publishing some of our team's early work and some of the narratives in public discourse around whose responsibility it really is to feed children at school, and highlighting the challenges of how we shift that discourse from the personal responsibility narrative in public health through to that idea of a common good or common responsibility, shared public responsibility for how we take care of kids' food at school. And lastly, consistent advocacy from researchers and civil society. Thank you. I will hand over to Katherine.
Thank you, Liesel. So when we talk about school meals, the evidence base is actually very compelling, and it's very consistent across now decades of international research. We know that diet and health improve with universal access school meals. Children who receive these meals eat more fruits and vegetables and less junk foods. Evidence from Finland and Brazil show these programs can reduce rates of overweight and obesity while improving nutritional status. Importantly, we know these school meals promote equity and food security. That universal approach ensures every child has consistent access to healthy food regardless of their circumstances, and therefore it avoids that stigma of charity-based food provision, which can create shame and stigma and discourage participation amongst families. We also know that school meals support education outcomes. Studies link these programs to better concentration, classroom behaviour, improved test scores, and very importantly, high school attendance, which is a critical marker that we know that the Education Department in Australia is very concerned with. Beyond health and education, the social benefits are also very profound. Children are willing to try new foods, which is important to me as a public health nutritionist, but principals and teachers report calmer classrooms and fewer behavioural incidents as well. And the system's benefits are also becoming documented, as Liesel indicated earlier. These programs, when they're set up well, can support local farmers, food businesses, through procurement policies that align with sustainability and climate goals, and at building those local regional food systems that strengthen community food security and food systems resilience. So these international models really show how powerful some of these systems-wide outcomes can be. So let's talk about some of our work so far as three researchers who are banding together in this space to try to advance the research agenda. I want to pass to Miriam, who's going to bring this to life a little bit, who's going to tell us about these beautiful photos from Sweden where those universal school meals have been embedded for decades.
Thanks, Katherine. So I was lucky enough to go across to a school in Malmö and to meet with the lead of the municipality's school food program in Malmö, Sweden. She decided that she'd take me to a restaurant where I sat down and ate the food that the students were actually eating that day, which you can see on the slide was a tortilla with beans and rice. There were also, it was the end of school terms. They had a range of different food available. There was a soup bar. There were burger patties and falafels and different types of wraps and a whole range of different salads and vegetables. Also, as part of the program they were using, I got a tour. It was just a really interesting insight into how they provide this food for a range of students at the school over a period of an hour and a half. So they have staggered meal times for different year groups. They weigh the food waste that they generate, and they have leaders that sort of keep on track of that. They also had some hydroponic food growing set up here, and this is one of the award-winning schools in the neighbourhood. So it's just a really interesting insight into the liveliness and what these types of school meal programs look like. I had a commercial kitchen. Yeah, it was just a really interesting experience to actually be able to go and see a particular school meal program that has been operating for a really long time, and to hear about that from the people who were running it. Thanks.
Just speaking as a parent of 2 school-age boys, what a joy that would be if my children ate that food at school every day instead of those beige sandwiches that I pack in the morning very begrudgingly. Okay, so some of our other work has been doing a stakeholder roundtable to talk with a range of different stakeholders from across New South Wales about what a universal access school meals program might look like. So we hosted a successful workshop late last year, which brought together policymakers, researchers, community leaders to really brainstorm what this would look like. What we were trying to do was discuss, I guess, the importance of universal school access meals in New South Wales context, but also in Australia more broadly. And we brought together people from very diverse backgrounds, which I'll explain on the next slide, to talk about how we actually start to advance this agenda. In particular, we wanted to comprehend what the current school food landscape looked like, discuss the potential need for a program, a universal school meals program, design a vision for this universal school meals program, and develop some actionable next steps. So we brought around 25 to 30 people together, spanning academics, practitioners, community organisations, charities, policy voices, and each added a very vital perspective. Researchers who were present shared the evidence base, why school meals matter for equity in nutrition. The community organisations and the food charities talked about the realities of food insecurity that they're seeing across schools, and actually the practicalities of delivering meals on the ground. We had kitchen garden and food literacy advocates who reminded us about the joy and the skills that come from learning about food within schools. Corporate partners offered a national lens on potential procurement and coordination challenges, and practitioners shared lessons, including those people running the Tasmanian pilot programs and other programs within the New South Wales context. We also had representatives from education and health who highlighted the practicalities of delivery and linking with curriculum and nutrition standards and public health outcomes. So what did we learn about? What we learned is that basically right now, from the perspective of most stakeholders in the room, is that school food in New South Wales is quite fragmented. So we have these canteens, breakfast clubs, gardens, charity programs, but they're quite uneven. They're reliant on volunteers and they're often underfunded. Partners tell us that there are plenty of kids coming to school without food, and what food is being brought is often unhealthy. There's this hidden reliance on parents and in particular women to provide daily lunches, which highlights an inequity in this as well. Most stakeholders agreed on the urgency of a universal approach. We talked about that a universal access school meal program would reduce stigma and ensure every kid has equal access to nutritious food. And we talked about the potential benefits, and many stakeholders, in particular from education, were very outspoken about the engagement and attendance within school as an important outcome. International models were discussed, and the pros and cons of each of those were discussed as well. So when we talked about blue sky visioning, we talked about a vision about universal access to food, but with local flexibility. It was really highlighted by many stakeholders that a model, even though it was universal, would have to be adapted to different geographic contexts and different cultural contexts. And this needed particular care across New South Wales and Australia. Integration with curriculum and current food literacy programs was considered to be key. We talked a lot about the potential about local food procurement, strengthening regional economies and stimulating workforce, and meals were framed as social and cultural events within the school to kind of build inclusion throughout the children and the staff. So the next steps were considered to be about really consolidating the evidence from the Australian pilots and other international programs and trying to figure out what are the sustainable governance and funding models that wouldn't be dependent on charity. We need to understand the infrastructure, the kitchen, staff and equipment, and invest potentially in a lot in this infrastructure. There would need to be shared governance across government, NGOs and corporate partners to trying to reduce the fragmentation of the school food approach. And there needs to be communication to address public concerns about cost, quality and parental responsibility among feeding children. So we've also done a little bit of advocacy as a team, and we've translated some of this research into, this is an example of one of these consumer-facing articles. And this article targeted parents and the wider public by trying to frame the everyday reality of school lunches in Australia, parents rushing to pack sandwiches or snacks, and the potential inequities of this BYO model. Our key advocacy messages were around that many Australians children are missing out on a daily meal at school, that school lunches are essential for health and other outcomes, and the benefits of universal school meals. And what I thought was very interesting was that this article reached plenty of people, and there were such diverse responses in the social media commentary around this. So here's 3 examples that I've just plucked from the Facebook thread that I had a look at. We had parents who were, very positive about universal access school meals. They had seen or heard about these models working in other places and spaces. Others were concerned that they wouldn't be properly funded and that they felt that schools were not adequately funded for the things that they had to deliver at present. And so it was a worry about how this would actually happen. And in particular, infrastructure was also noted as some of those big concerns about how this would actually be a practical reality. There were some very colourful comments about, I guess, the role of government in supporting children to access food and whose responsibility would it be in feeding children, and very diverse opinions across the community. We also translated some of this work into a policy piece that was written for the policymaker, framing universal school meals as a systemic solution that requires government leadership. So the key messages within this article were all about equity, about requiring joined up governance, particularly between education and health, and pulling together all of this international evidence, showing it's feasible, effective, and delivers benefits. So we've heard about where we are now and where we want to be, which is taking us from this patchwork of program towards a system where every child has access to a healthy school meal. And we have worked a lot to try to discuss what is actually missing. How are we going to get there? The gaps that we see that need to be filled are strong policy leadership and clear political will. We need to have a better understanding of funding models and how it might work here in Australia. What investment would be required in infrastructure, and how would a whole of government and regulatory framework actually work within our contexts? There's lots of work going on evaluating and finding out information about how we scale up pilots of these school meal programs. And we also have to take steps to understand what it's going to take to get community buy-in and to shape this public positive narrative. But the reality is, we're only a small group of folks. We're applying for funding to advance some of this. So our focus has to be quite feasible and achievable on ways to kind of advance this needle, which means being strategic and trying to choose the areas that we think can have the biggest impact for broader change. So before I take you through our process, I do want to acknowledge there's lots of other key players working in building the evidence around school meals, their pilot programs and the delivery. And what we're trying to do is trying to complement some of that work by filling gaps and building partnerships and trying to advance the case for universal school meals. So from everything that we've heard, it's very clear that we need to take a step-by-step approach. We can't do everything at once. So we've tried to outline some key steps that we think are very important. Oops, this pop-up hasn't worked in the way I was hoping it would. Sorry, I'll just click through. So the first is to try to understand more clearly the current landscape. We know it's fragmented and there's no system-wide strategy. So one of our first actions is going to be mapping very clearly what's already happening in New South Wales schools and reviewing international programs. In particular, we want to understand further funding models and delivery models. Because if we can understand how different countries organise, pay for and sustain their programs, we might be able to bring some opportunities to life here. We know that credibility depends on who's at the table, so we're planning on establishing an advisory group to guide projects, including community consultation groups to keep this grounded in lived experience. And then we want to listen to communities. Some of the work that we're planning is running large-scale surveys to understand the voices of different people across our community, in particular what parents and carers want and what barriers that they face. We'll also hold co-design workshops with schools and canteens and NGOs to try to design a program that could reflect cultural, social and practicalities. We also need to check what's possible. We have some plans to audit the facilities across a range of urban, rural and regional schools to find out what type of facilities are present and what needs to actually be invested in or adapted to deliver school meals. And we've partnered with an economist. After gathering all of this data, we need to assess the potential cost, the benefits and the return on investment. We know policymakers are going to ask, how much is this going to cost? Is this worth it? So we plan to test different funding models and different delivery models to figure out what might work. And sharing our vision. Our ultimate goal is to publish an implementation-ready plan of universal school meals in New South Wales and share this with policymakers and particular with the New South Wales government, a plan that's grounded in evidence and community voices and hopefully ready to be taken forward. So I'm going to pass over to Lily, if that's okay. We were hoping for your help to facilitate this blue sky visioning and gather the perspective and the voices from people within the room.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Katherine, Liesel and Miriam. That was really great to hear. And you've already got hands up. I'm going to spotlight the three of you. And so these are questions that we will be discussing.